Good afternoon, students. Today we will be discussing the vice of gluttony. Now, like all the other vices, really, and perhaps more so with the vice of gluttony, this vice has suffered from distortion. And so, just as the other vices have gotten reduced to something that may be a part of the vice but is not the whole of it, gluttony too has gotten reduced to something that is a part of it, an aspect of it, a sign of it, but is not the whole of the vice. So the obvious example from our past look at some of the vices is sloth. Sloth is now seen as physical laziness. And that's just not the vice of sloth from history. So the vice of sloth, historically speaking, was, as I put it, being lazy about love, seeing God's call, the demands that God's love places on our life as burdensome, as heavy, as too much to bear, and so shrugging them off, neglecting them. That's a far cry from physical laziness, and in fact, as Dr. DeYoung noted, and as I reiterated in the video lecture, the in our culture, which is, I believe, historically speaking, the hardest working culture in history, the vice of sloth is alive and well. In fact, our addiction to work, our busyness, is itself a sign and symptom of the vice of sloth. So we've reduced the vices to an aspect of them, a symptom of them, a minor part of them. And in doing so, right, we become blinded to the reality of the vice. We become blinded also to the severity of the vice, just how bad this is. So one of the things, in terms of that badness, one of the things that I want to emphasize here, and I'll emphasize even more in the next lecture on lust, is how each of the vices cuts us off, isolates us from God, from ourselves, and from one another. And fascinatingly, gluttony does this in pretty extreme and actually obvious ways. So I want you to think about this. How do the vices cut me off from God? How do they cut me off from others? And how do they cut me off from myself? They result in the vices, part of their trajectory, right? Part of their natural movement is radical isolation from God, from others, and from self. So that's a fascinating thing to investigate. How exactly do they do it? We'll think about that as we work through the vice of gluttony. Before proceeding, I want you to be careful of confusing the vices as well. This is another way, I think, to water down the vices, to make them less bad than they actually are, and also to cover them up in our own lives. So, for example, many people want to use the term gluttony or lust or greed to talk about all sorts of things. Now, in some cases, that may be okay when you're being very careful. Dr. DeYoung is careful. St. Thomas Aquinas is careful. Most of us are not careful when we use these terms to describe all sorts of other things. So we might think about the person who is addicted to pornography or sex or something like that. We might think of them as greedy, right, or gluttonous. And what we're doing there, right, is we're applying these terms greed and gluttony to sexual pleasure, sexual desire. And here's one of the consequences of this, it seems to me. One of the consequences of this is that in my community, let's say, lust is seen as really gross and nasty, and it's very embarrassing. And so instead of thinking of myself as lustful, which is gross and nasty and embarrassing, I think of myself as greedy. And in my community, it just so happens that being greedy, while not really endorsed and praised, isn't that bad. So when I use the term greed to describe my my actual lust, I've actually watered it down. I've made my lust less bad. So I think, look, we've got these concepts, and the concepts are different. Greed is not the same as lust. It's not the same as gluttony. There's connections, of course, and as I said, if you're very careful, it might be okay in some circumstances to use those terms. But we've got those concepts, the concept of sloth and vainglory, the concept of envy, and they are different from one another. And so let's use the concepts that we have, lest we confuse them with others, and lest we water down and thereby reduce the badness of the vices that we may be struggling with. Okay, now on to gluttony. Gluttony is described, once again, Thomas Aquinas is our lead here. Gluttony is described primarily and intrinsically as the intemperate desire to consume food and drink. It's not the intemperate consumption of food. Okay, so let's think about that just a second. So gluttony primarily and intrinsically signifies the intemperate desire to consume food and drink, not the intemperate consumption of food. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that means that gluttony has to do with a desire, first and foremost. It has to do with the desire. It does not have to do with the amount of food we eat in general. And here's an obvious illustration for this. Suppose Frank is a bodybuilder. Right? This is a famous example, by the way, from Aristotle. So suppose Frank is a bodybuilder. Well, Frank is a bodybuilder, let's say, and let's say he's a 250-pound bodybuilder. He's in great shape. His health is amazing. But Frank is a 250-pound bodybuilder. This guy needs to eat a ton of food each day. Let's say his caloric intake needs to be 5,000 calories a day for him to maintain his health and his physique. Now, if I eat 5,000 calories a day, I am overeating in a very unhealthy manner. I suspect the same is true for most of you. But Frank's eating 5,000 calories a day is perfectly okay. Right? So when we talk about gluttony, we're talking about an attitude that we have towards food and drink. Frank can still be gluttonous. His gluttony is just not going to be the gluttony of overeating, overconsumption. Okay? It's our attitude towards food and drink. And in this way, tons of skinny people, tons of people who are actually in impeccable health may very well be suffering from gluttony. I think of persons who are vegetarians or vegans. Not all vegetarians or vegans are like this. My daughter was a vegetarian and then a vegan for quite a long time. And I don't know, but I don't think she suffered in the following way. But a lot of vegetarians and vegans that I know are consumed with thoughts of food and drink. It masters them. It occupies their mind constantly. And so in that case, it sounds like it may be that they are suffering from an intemperate, that is a disordered desire for food and drink. They're thinking about it constantly. It occupies their mind more than it ought to. Okay, so that's the vice of gluttony. Where is your desire for food and drink in the hierarchy of all your other desires? Okay, and so I'll give you a bunch of examples about this in just a second. Dr. DeYoung gives the acronym FRESH. It's a wonderful, wonderful mnemonic device to help us remember the 5 forms of gluttony. And so I'll go over those in just a moment, but just to throw them out here right now, it's eating too daintily or fastidiously, sumptuously, hastily, greedily, too much. I'll get to the FRESH acronym in just a moment. But at this point, I want to talk about just one of them. This sort of, I think this probably illustrates sumptuous eating, okay? So this is the S part of FRESH, sumptuous eating. C.S. Lewis has this great story or parable, we might call it, about sex and food. And of course, sex and food, there's some fascinating connections here, right? Both are natural bodily desires. We naturally desire, most of us do, some people don't. We naturally desire food, we naturally desire drink, we naturally desire sex. And so C.S. Lewis says he points out how uh, crazy our natural desire for sex has become in our culture. And he points this out, right? He seeks to illustrate this with the following sort of story. He says something along these lines. Imagine someone bringing out a turkey on like one of those plates, those serving silver dishes, and it's covered up with, let's say, a really nice sort of napkin or something like that. And this person is bringing out the turkey to a room full of people, and the lights are dimmed, let's say, and there's some music playing in the background. Maybe some sultry music is playing in the background, and as the person brings out the turkey, they're sort of swaying back and forth, and they're slowly revealing parts of the turkey with the napkin, right? And the people's hearts are beginning to beat a bit faster and faster as the excitement of seeing more and more of the turkey is revealed to them. Well, what does that sound like, right? This is a sort of food striptease. And it sounds nuts. It sounds crazy. And C.S. Lewis's point is that just as that is crazy, so our treating of sex in the same manner is crazy. Now, here's a quote from C.S. Lewis. He says, "If anyone says that sex in itself is bad, Christianity contradicts him at once." So in other words, Christianity does not think that sex in itself is bad. In fact, Christianity believes that sex in itself is beautiful and can be, in Roman Catholicism and in Anglicanism and other denominations within the body of Christ, sex can actually be seen as a kind of sacred act. Okay, so starting again. If anyone says that sex in itself is bad, Christianity contradicts him at once. But of course, when people say, sex is nothing to be ashamed of, they may mean the following. The state into which the sexual instinct has now got is nothing to be ashamed of. In other words, they move from sex in itself isn't bad, so therefore the way we're thinking about and treating sex today isn't bad. And C.S. Lewis goes on to say, if they mean that, I think they are wrong. I think it is everything to be ashamed of, our current way of thinking about the sexual instinct. There is nothing to be ashamed of, he says, in enjoying your food. There would be everything to be ashamed of if half the world made food the main interest of their lives and spent their time looking at pictures of food and dribbling and smacking their lips. Okay. So, when we treat both sex and food and drink as so important that they occupy so much of our lives, something has gone seriously, seriously bad. Something has gone seriously wrong. Now, what's funny about Lewis's comment or quote that I just gave you is that he thought we would never really treat food and drink in the same way that we treat sex. But watch the Food Network. Watch the Travel Channel. Watch these other shows where we're invited to sort of look upon food and drink as the most important things in our lives. We have channels on television that are devoted to sex, channels on television channels on the internet devoted to sex, and we have channels devoted to food and drink. What's fascinating here from a philosophical point of view is, man, we can pervert anything and everything and take it to radical extremes. Now, I'm not saying that the Food Network is bad and you shouldn't watch it. I watch the Food Network sometimes. But the point is that these channels and these shows are elevating food and drink to a status in our lives that they clearly should not be, it seems to me. Our love of food and drink should be far less than our love for a ton of other things. Okay, so food and drink can occupy the same level of desire in our lives as sex does, as our family and friends, as relationship and intimacy, as our desire for knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, and even as our love for God. We can replace all of those things with a desire for food and drink. And so St. Augustine, realizing this, counsels us to consider the physical, social, and spiritual aspects involved in eating and drinking. So St. Augustine has 3 axes that he wants us to consider as we think about food and drink. Okay, as we think about eating and drinking. So these 3 aspects I really want us to think about together, and I think these 3 aspects also bring out how this vice of gluttony can isolate us from God, each other, and ourselves. Okay, so there's obviously a physical component. There's a physical axis. So you can think about this as sort of like a Cartesian grid. And on this grid, right, we have a y-axis, that's the vertical axis. We have an x-axis, that's the horizontal axis. And then we have, let's say, a z-axis. And this is the diagonal axis that's supposed to sort of come out of the page. And basically what Augustine is telling us is he's saying that each one of these axes needs to be adhered to, needs to be respected in order for our eating and drinking habits to be proper. If any of those axes is out of whack, out of place, then there's something wrong with our eating and drinking activities. Okay, so take the physical axis. The physical axis emphasizes the primary function of eating, which of course is nourishment. That's the primary function of eating and drinking, is to nourish our body. So as Aquinas notes, God in his wisdom and love includes pleasure in our eating. And indeed, he includes pleasure in all things necessary for our continued existence and the continued existence of the species. God didn't have to do this. But he did, and Aquinas sees this as an act of love. He sees this as a demonstration, a sign of God's goodness to us, that pleasure has been added to eating, drinking, and sex. So the experience of pleasure in eating and drinking should remind us of God, should remind us of God's goodness in adding pleasurable sensations to these acts. So while we eat, right, we have to keep these things in mind, right? It's for our nourishment. Pleasure has been added to this activity because of God's wisdom and love and goodness. We have to ask ourselves the following question: is eating being done to restore health to our bodies or for some other reason? Are we eating primarily for, well, let me put it like this. This doesn't have to be this doesn't have to be in the forefront of your mind. Okay, my main desire when I sit down to eat and drink has to be for nourishment, for replenishing nutrients in my body. That's not what Augustine is saying. What Augustine is saying is this: you should not eat in such a way that it presents an obstacle to nourishment. Okay, so don't eat in such a way, don't drink in such a way that you damage your body. Doing so is contrary to the primary function of eating, and that is wrong, Augustine says. So, because the emphasis is on eating and drinking in such a way that it damages your body, Augustine is not counseling us against dessert. He's not counseling us against drinking a glass of wine or a glass of beer. Some of you might think that drinking alcohol is morally wrong. I'm not going to give a defense of drinking alcohol here. My point is that Augustine isn't on this physical axis telling us don't have desserts, don't drink a glass of wine, or things like that, or don't eat and drink tasty food. But he's saying you need to be aware of your eating and drinking habits in such a way that you have to ask yourself, is this next bite, is this next drink damaging my body? If the answer is yes, then it is wrong to do so. Okay, so that's the physical aspect. Now notice that when I eat and drink in such a way that it damages my body, right, that can have terrible effects on all sorts of other aspects of my life, right? It can damage my relationships, right? My ability to engage in relationships with others can be damaged. Um, think about it like this, right? How many of you have overeaten and experienced that awful feeling of being too full, being overly stuffed? I've experienced it. I hate it. What happens to you? Your mental capacities diminish, right? I don't want to engage in deep, serious conversation when that happens. I really just want to go lay down and fall asleep, right? I become like a gross, nasty dog or goat or something after I eat too much. And so my social relationships are impaired. Okay, so that's the physical axis. Let's look at the social axis. The social axis emphasizes that eating and drinking are necessarily social acts. How so? Well, think about it. When we prepare food, it's often necessary for the avoidance of waste, um, wasting food, wasting energy in the kitchen to prepare more than one person can consume. Right? Oftentimes we prepare, it makes sense. It's a good thing to prepare more food than just you can consume. So, preparation often involves making enough for others as well as oneself. Second, we tend to eat at similar times, which is helpful for our bodies and consolidates energy. So, I'm not the only one preparing to eat at this time of day, but others are preparing to eat as well. Third, eating together is almost always better than eating alone, right? Why? Well, maybe because it's more enjoyable to share good things with others. I've made this great meal and I love to share good things. Think back in a previous video lecture where I talked about the diffusiveness of goodness, right? How goodness, we want to share God's great gifts that He's given us. I think I talked about that. I could talk about that actually for a bunch of the vices, but I believe I talked about that for the vice of vainglory. We have a desire to be known, we have a desire to know others. And eating and drinking together can be a part of that, right? I made a great meal and I want others to share in it. I want others to experience this great meal that I've made. Goodness wants to spread itself, flow outward to others, and we see this in eating and drinking together. The act of eating is accompanied by other things, right? The act of eating together is accompanied by other things, reflection, conversation, right? Eating and drinking together is often the best time, the most natural time for families to come together and to engage in conversation. So I once had a friend growing up whose family every single day, this was not a Christian family. They were atheists, but every single day at 5 p.m., the girl, my friend, had to be at home no matter the day, no matter what was going on. Now, when she got older, she had a job, and that inhibited some of that. But every single time she was off at 5 p.m., if she was off that day at 5 p.m. and living in the home, she was required to be there for dinner. And that was the time that the family shared their lives together. So that's a normal sort of thing, right? In most cultures, eating is a very important part of the day. In fact, in the American culture, this is again a sign of sloth, in the American culture, right, we're one of the only ones where we eat a ton by ourselves. Many of our meals are not taken together. In many other cultures, that just doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen as often as it does in our culture. Sharing a meal together requires sharing, and thus it also requires some form of discipline and restraint. right? We're conversing, we're sharing together, and in so doing, eating and drinking can unite us or divide us. Think about, has this ever happened to you? You're sitting at the table. There's a large pizza on the table, and you're getting closer and closer to the last piece. I remember as my son was growing older and his appetite was growing bigger, we would maybe order a pizza on Monday evening, and more, right? He was eating not just two pieces, now three. Not just three pieces, now four. And him and I would compete with each other silently as to who would get that last piece of pizza. And our focus then became on getting that last piece of pizza and eating the pizza on our plate a bit faster. Conversation dwindled. Our focus was on the food, and sometimes we would even be annoyed at one another. I say this to my shame. Pray for me. Okay, so there's this social aspect of eating. Here's another social aspect of eating. There's all sorts of fascinating ones. For everyone all over the world, most of these people are not preparing every bit of their food by themselves. Some of it they're purchasing at farmers markets, at the grocery store, on the side of the road, whatever. Well, what does that tell us? That tells us that there is a long history here to most of the food and most of the drinks that we consume. That's a social aspect as well. Who prepared this? Who helped harvest this? Who planted this food? Now, if you live on a farm and whatnot, those questions are much easier to answer. But even then, where did the seeds come from? The soil. Uh, Things along those lines. We can be aware of those things, right? And so we can think about those aspects as we eat, right? Those social aspects as we eat. I think in a previous lecture I mentioned chocolate, right? A ton of the chocolate consumed in the world is prepared by persons who are in effect slaves. That's a social aspect to our eating. We can be aware of that. We have the means of knowing about that. And that should inform our eating. Here's some other examples. We'll talk about those 5 forms again in just a second, but think about the form of pickiness. I have had students who have wanted to come with my wife and I to India. I would love, by the way, for any of you to come with us to India. We go every January during J term. It counts as a legit course and satisfies your some of your cultural enrichment requirements. We've had students want to go to India, and their chief concern for some of these students has been the food. Now, that's understandable. We've got a lot of students, right, whose chief concern, who are worried about the food in India. Maybe they're worried about the health aspect of it. Maybe they're worried about the spice. Maybe their stomach. We've had some students who are gluten-free. We've had some students who have other food allergies, and they're concerned about that. Nothing wrong with that. We've had many students with such concerns come anyway, and they've figured out ways to eat and overcome some of those obstacles. Nevertheless, we've had a number of students decide not to go to India because their concern over food was overwhelming them. Think about what's going on there. They have decided not to engage in an amazing trip, a trip that changes many people's lives. I promise you, if you talk to students who've gone on this trip, they will attest to that. It has changed my life in deep ways. We've had students who have decided to not go on a life-changing experience because of food or because of drink. That's amazing. I think it's incredibly sad. Another social aspect of this. Have you ever cut yourself off from engaging in sociality, from engaging in relation with others because of food? Have your food preferences cut you off from others? Well, think about some of these cases. We once had some students come over to our home. These were Korean students, and we've always been very close to the international students. And we had some Korean students, this was probably about 6 or 7 years ago, come to our home in tears. And they told us the following story. They were preparing a meal, a Korean traditional meal, on their floor. and the smell was quite strong, and it was powerful. And they overheard students on their floor mocking the smell, complaining about the smell, and saying all sorts of terrible things about the food. These students, they were proud of their heritage and their culture, and they were extremely upset over what had happened. Those other students mocking it, right, cut themselves off, hurt another person over food and drink. Um, think about it like this. How many of you have alcoholics in your family? I'll bet you there's a lot. There have been a ton in mine. In fact, my father was an alcoholic and lost his life to it. Now, think about it along these lines. I enjoy drinking a glass of beer, a glass of wine, a mixed drink every once in a while. I try not to be gluttonous and overdrink. I usually only have one drink, maybe once a week or a couple times a month or something. It's not that often. But there have been occasions when my mom or dad were in my home and I had an opportunity to serve wine or serve alcohol. Knowing that my father was a struggling alcoholic, what would that have looked like? I can refrain from doing so, from drinking quite easily. To include that in the meal, right, would be an incredible social statement. Food and drink has a social element that we have to recognize. Why am I eating? So here's the question to ask. Are my eating and drinking habits cutting me off from others? I had an aunt who we went to a restaurant one time, and at the restaurant, our first table was too close to the window and too sunny. Our second table was right under the vent and too cold. Our third table was right under the fan, and that breeze was annoying. Our fourth table was in the middle of traffic, and it was frustrating and a distraction. I'm not joking, we moved 5 or 6 times. By the time we finally sat down to eat, not one of us was interested in engaging in deep conversation and intimate relations. Not one of us. The meal was ruined. Are our eating and drinking habits cutting us off for others? Are we too picky? Are we too focused on eating that we don't engage in the conversation lest we don't get enough? We're afraid that others are going to take too much of the food that is set before us. Are our eating and drinking habits cutting us off from others? The last aspect is the spiritual aspect, right? And so we must eat, of course, to survive. We're dependent on food to live and thus dependent on external things to live. We're dependent on things that are not in our control, right? We're dependent on weather, dependent on sunlight, dependent on rain, dependent on soil. We're dependent on others to do the work of cultivating, harvesting, planting the food. This dependence should recall to our minds that we cannot live without external conditions being satisfied. We are radically dependent creatures. Radically dependent. We are not self-sufficient. Our lives depend on all sorts of things that are outside of our control. So our need for food mirrors also other needs that we have, spiritual needs that are in fact food-like. We need God's sustenance both for our bodies. We need God to uphold the laws of nature, God to uphold the universe. But we also need God to uphold our souls, right? So we need God's sustenance both for our bodies and for our souls. And does our eating reflect this? Does it recall to us that God is in control and we rely on Him, that we are dependent upon Him, right? Does it unite us to Him in any way? Do your eating and drinking habits unite you to God, or do they actually separate you from God? Think about over drinking alcohol. This is a great way to separate you from others and to separate you from God. Think about the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is the most obvious, continuous sacrament of the church. A sacrament is a sacred sign of God's presence, His love and His grace in our lives. And the sign that God has used as a continuous reminder in the life of the believer of His grace and presence in our lives is food and drink. That's fascinating and powerful. The Lord's Supper, right, which involves bread and wine, teaches us something, right? It's supposed to point us to the body of Christ, the blood of Christ. Do your eating and drinking habits and activities do this? Do they remind you of who God is and of what Christ has done for us? There's sort of two elements involved in the spiritual aspect. One is the element of feasting, and the other is the element of fasting. In fact, these are remedies that have been used throughout the ages in the church to address gluttony. Feasting is actually supposed to help us address gluttony. Isn't that interesting? So think about it like this. Many of you know about Lent, and many of you might practice Lent. For Lent, you fast for how many days? 40. Right? So you give something up. And traditionally, it is supposed to be something related to food and drink. It's not really supposed to be something also that is easy to give up. So if I gave up alcohol for 40 days, that's nothing. I do that all the time. But if I give up iced tea, look how big that thing is. I love iced tea. If I give up iced tea for 40 days, that's rough. That's going to be hard on me. Lent, you're supposed to give up food and some food or drink item for 40 days such that you will notice it every single day of your life, right? You'll be reminded, nope, can't do that. I'm supposed to, instead of engaging in that, I'm supposed to worship God, pray to God, praise God. Okay, but did you know that the whole season of Lent is actually 46, 47 days? Well, what about those other days? Well, those other days are Sundays. On Sundays, you're supposed to feast. And the fast does not apply on Sundays for traditional followers of Lent. So if I give up iced tea for Lent, on Sundays, I am supposed to consume it. I feast on Sunday. So feasting is a sign, right, of God's great provision for us. And of course, you don't feast alone, right? It's not a feast by yourself. You feast with others. Right? So there's the social element involved. Fasting, right? Fasting also reminds us that our bodies, right? Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. Fasting reminds us that our bodies do not rule us. Our senses do not rule us. Our appetites do not rule us. We are to rule them, not them us. Our bellies and our mouths are not to be masters of us. We are to be masters of them, and fasting helps us master that. Traditionally, the church has fasted every Friday. So from after dinner on Thursday, traditionally Christians have fasted until dinner on Friday. This was to remind them of the suffering of Christ. Right? This is Black Friday, or Good Friday, excuse me. This is to remind them of the suffering of Christ on the cross. And it's to prepare their hearts for worship on Sunday. And Sunday is a joyous day. The resurrection of Christ took place on Sunday. And we're to celebrate. It's supposed to be joyous. We're to have the Lord's Supper, which is a feast for us. 3 axes. Any one of the axes is out of whack. Our food and drinking habits, according to Augustine, are out of whack. Now let's look at those 5 forms. Those 5 forms of gluttony are F, fastidious eating. This is the picky eater. And I already talked about that one. Being a picky eater can obviously cut us off from others. Obviously, right? It can cut us off from God. Right? We start being annoyed with food. We start being frustrated with us. And the picky eater, right, eating can occupy, drinking can occupy their mind a ton, so much that they organize their day to make sure that they're very selective and narrow desires for food and drink are satisfied. Now, as I said, we have students who are picky, maybe because of food allergies or things like that, who figure out a way to get around that. Okay? So the idea here is not that you can't sort of have tastes for food or preferences for food. It's that those should not get in the way of relationships with others and with God. We've got R. R is the ravenous eater, the person who eats so fast. Think about the person who's eating super, who's just shoveling it in. That person doesn't have time to engage in conversation. That person doesn't have time to reflect upon food and drink and its relationship to God, how it points to His grace and provision, how it points to our radical dependence upon other things beside ourselves, how it points to our radical dependence on others in the preparation and cultivation and harvesting of this food. That person's mind is just consumed with getting it in and getting it down. E, this is the excessive eater. This is what gluttony has been reduced to. When we think of gluttony, we think of massively fat people. Many of those massively obese people are not gluttons. Maybe there's a thyroid problem. Maybe there's a historical genetic issue here. You cannot tell a glutton by looking at them. You cannot tell a glutton by the shape of their body. Now, there may be indicators, right? You can look at the habits, and that's going to be a heck of a lot easier to see if they're a glutton. You cannot tell a greedy person by the car they drive. This is a mistake that I make a lot. You cannot tell a greedy person by the purse they carry and the clothes they wear. There may be all sorts of reasons for what they're doing. Right? Maybe that person has that big, huge, massive SUV because they were involved in accidents earlier in their life, and that's the only way they can get in a car and feel safe. Maybe their children were killed in a car accident in a small, compact vehicle, and they can't step into a car thinking about it, and they only feel safe in a big, huge, massive SUV. You cannot tell a greedy person. Now, those may be indicators. If you care, if you care so much about your car, what it looks like, the expense of it, and so on and so forth, there may be vainglory issues. There may be greed issues. Those can be indicators, but they are not guarantees. Similarly with obesity. So gluttony has been reduced to the E in fresh, excessive eating. That's a danger, because picky eaters can be gluttons. Ravenous eaters can be gluttons. Okay, the S, right, in fresh. The S stands for sumptuousness. This is the person who is, going for the tastiest. They love the feeling of being full. They love the tastiest portion. So you can imagine at dinner, the person who gets really annoyed and ticked off when they get that portion of the lasagna that's burnt. That person who gets the portion of the cake that doesn't have that awesome frosting on it. Right? That person who gets the last thin piece of pizza that has way too much crust. Maybe you're a fan of tons of crust. If you are, you're crazy. All right. So the sumptuous eater, right? Again, their focus is wrong, right? Their focus is wrong, and that's going to cut them off from others. The excessive eater is going to be cut off from others because, right, they're going to be at a meal and others might be grossed out at the amount of food they're eating. And furthermore, that person may eat too much and others don't get enough. H, the hasty eater. This is really the person who eats when they shouldn't. Right? So they eat all day. They snack all day long. They're just, mindlessly throwing food in. That mindlessness is part of the problem. We can eat reflectively. We can eat lovingly. We can eat compassionately and empathetically. Or we can eat mindlessly like a mere dog or cow or goat. We're called to eat lovingly, mindfully, reflectively, compassionately. Okay, so those are the 5 forms of gluttony. You definitely need to know them. You could probably think of tons of stories about them. Okay, now how does this, what is it that goes wrong here with gluttony? Well, obviously, gluttony perverts a very good thing. Right? A desire for food and drink is not wrong. In fact, it's necessary for us to continue to live. And that desire for food and drink can be a holy, wonderful, beautiful desire. Right? As I said, right, this can remind us of God and his great provision. This can remind us of others, how deeply we are connected to others and need others to survive. Right? But when that desire gets perverted, right? Remember, the privation theory of evil tells us that all badness is a perversion, a twisting, a distortion of something that is more basic, of something that is beautiful and wonderful and good. So gluttony takes this good thing and perverts it into something that is nasty, that cuts us off from others, cuts us off from God, and can cut us off from even ourselves. Right? The glutton thinks that food and drink is going to satisfy them. You know, the stereotypical woman who eats a ton of ice cream after she's broken up or had a fight with her boyfriend. Right? The guy who lounges all day on, watching football and putting potato chips in his mouth. Those stereotypes, right? They're using food and drink to satisfy a deeply spiritual, social, personal, relational desire. How could they possibly think that food and drink could satisfy that? They have become distant from themselves. They don't even know their own deep desires and needs. Gluttony can cut us off from God, from others, and from ourselves. Where does this show up in the garden? It shows up in the garden in a really fascinating way. Think about it like this. What is the sin? The sin is eating. It's eating a particular thing that was forbidden. Every other thing in the garden was permissible for consumption. They could eat of any tree. They could drink of any river. They could drink the fruits out of any of the fruit in the garden. There was one thing that was forbidden to them, and it had to do with eating and drinking. Isn't it fascinating that the fall involves consumption? The fall involves eating. It involves food. That's fascinating to me. In the scriptures it says that she saw the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it was pleasing to the eye. So I don't want to comment more on it. I'll let you think about it, but that is absolutely fascinating. Food and drink can ruin our lives. It damned our species in a sense. What is more important to you? Obedience, loving God, rejoicing in the fact that he loves you, or eating and drinking?